The city was in the grip of severe weather caused by a cyclone that enveloped half the town. Consequently, air traffic controllers decided to temporarily close the runway until morning. Nadezhda, unable to fly, checked her standard suitcase into a storage locker. Then she changed into comfortable jeans and a jacket, buying a ticket for the last scheduled bus to the city. After 3 hours of driving along the night highway, she fell asleep, resting her head against the cool window pane. In her dreams, she suddenly saw not a scene of clouds, but the kitchen she shared with Kostya. The bright yellow light flooding the dining table, the delicate aroma of freshly brewed coffee, his warm hands resting on her shoulders. She arrived home just before 1 in the morning. The familiar smell of dampness and cat urine greeted her as she returned to the entryway. The light bulb on the second floor had burned out again. Nadezhda climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, trying to step as quietly as possible to avoid jingling her keys. She figured Kostya would probably already be asleep. He always went to bed early, often complaining of insomnia if she returned home late and disturbed the silence. The apartment door opened soundlessly. A month ago, she had oiled its hinges herself. The light was on in the hallway, which struck her as quite unusual. A stranger's coat, dark blue with a fur collar, hung on a coat rack. She'd seen this piece of clothing countless times. It was her mother-in-law's coat. Nadezhda froze, holding the keys in her hand. Voices drifted from the kitchen. One belonged to Kostya, the other to a woman, with a distinctly authoritative tone. She took off her shoes, walked down the hallway, and pushed open the bedroom door. She turned on the light, acting automatically, without any conscious thought. On their bed, on her side, where she'd slept for the past 3 years, lay Valentina Sergeyevna. Her mother-in-law slept, covered with the blanket Nadezhda had brought back from her trip to Prague. Her mouth was slightly open, and she was snoring softly. Nadezhda glanced at the nightstand. Where her face cream and book usually sat, there was now a photograph in a morning frame. A young woman with dark hair and a soft, inviting smile looked at her from behind the glass. It was Lenochka, Kostya's first wife, who had passed away 5 years ago from cancer. Nadezhda's fingers seemed glued to the keys. She stood there, unable to tear her gaze from the photograph, from her sleeping mother-in-law, from her pillow, knocked over by someone else's head, and felt something slowly harden inside her. At that moment, Kostya burst out of the kitchen, barefoot, dressed in sweatpants and a stretched-out t-shirt. His expression expressed guilt mingled with mild irritation, like a child caught in the act. He grabbed her by the elbow and pulled her into the hallway, hissing so as not to wake his mother. His parents, he explained, had decided to move temporarily. His father, he said, had a worsening heart condition. He needed care, and their own apartment was now rented out. The money from the rent would go towards medication. His mother, he added, insisted on keeping Lenochka's photo in the bedroom. It calmed her down. This, he assured her, wouldn't last long, a month or 2, until her father got better. Nadezhda listened to him in silence. She looked at her husband, at his shifty eyes, at the way he rubbed his neck, a familiar gesture that always signaled a lie, and remained silent. Then she took out her phone, found Marina's number in her contacts, a friend she'd met back in college and who worked as a realtor, pressed call, and put the phone on speakerphone. Kostya flinched and tried to grab the phone, but Nadezhda took a step back. The ringing echoed down the dark hallway. 1, 2, 3. Then there was a click, and Marina's sleepy voice said, "Nadia, why are you so late?" Nadezhda replied, "Have you checked?" Marina was silent for a second, then spoke in a different tone, businesslike and collected. "Nadia, you asked me to check. Your relative's apartment is not rented. It was sold 2 months ago. The buyer is Konstantin Sergeyevich Volkov." The mug of tea fell from Kostya's hands and smashed on the floor. He stood in a puddle of cold tea, surrounded by shards, and looked at the phone as if it had turned into a grenade. A rustling sound came from the bedroom. Valentina Sergeyevna appeared in the doorway. Her hair was disheveled, and a mark from a pillow was visible on her cheek. She had heard the conversation. She grabbed the door frame and slowly slid down the wall until she sank to the floor. The dropped phone call probably explained everything. Marina understood everything. She promised to call back tomorrow. That didn't matter now. Nadezhda looked at her husband and waited. Kostya opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. Then he began speaking haltingly, confusedly, jumping from one thought to another. His mother herself had suggested that the apartment remain in the family so that strangers wouldn't live in the parental home. That was reasonable, right? That was logical. Nadezhda asked, "Where did the money come from?" He fell silent, rubbed his neck, and looked away. She repeated the question. Her voice was even, almost calm, and it frightened her. Kostya confessed. From their shared savings, from the $180,000 she had been saving for 3 years for a down payment on her own place, she took extra flights, night flights, holiday flights, flying while sick and tired, counting every penny, and he took the money and bought his mother an apartment. Valentina Sergeyevna rose from the floor. There was no longer any confusion in her eyes. Her back straightened, her chin lifted, and when she spoke, her voice became stern and businesslike, the voice of a woman accustomed to command. "The apartment now belongs to Kostya," she said, "and that means to his future children, from the right woman." She looked at Nadezhda with an expression she had seen hundreds of times over the past 3 years, a mixture of disdain and condescension. "You're infertile. I know you've been trying for 3 years. Kostya needs a normal wife who will give birth, and you're a temporary one." Nadezhda turned to her husband. She expected him to object, to tell his mother to shut up, to step between them and protect her at least once in 3 years. But Kostya stared at the floor, at the shards of his mug, at the puddle of tea, at his bare feet. He was silent. His silence was louder than any words. Nadezhda walked past them into the kitchen, sat down at the table, the same one where they had breakfast every morning when she was home, placed her hands on the countertop, and stared out the window into the darkness. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She was thinking. At 5 in the morning, when the light was beginning to break, she picked up the phone and dialed the number of the fertility clinic where she and Kostya had undergone a checkup a year ago. The answering machine offered to leave a message or call back during business hours. Nadezhda chose the latter. She knew exactly what the report said. Kostya picked up the results himself and said the doctors were recommending further testing, that nothing was clear yet. She believed him. She had always trusted him. Now she wanted to see the results with her own eyes. The email from the clinic arrived at 8:47 a.m. Nadezhda sat in the kitchen with her cold tea, which she hadn't finished, and watched as her phone screen lit up with a new notification. She opened the email, skimmed through the polite wording, and found the attachment, a scan of a year-old medical report. She read it 3 times. The letters blurred, refolded themselves, and each time said the same thing. Diagnosis, azoospermia. Patient, Konstantin Sergeyevich Volkov. His wife's results were within normal limits. No reproductive pathology was detected. Nadezhda remembered that day a year ago. Kostya went to the clinic alone. She was on a flight to Novosibirsk. She returned that evening and asked about the results. He shrugged and said the doctors recommended further testing, that nothing was clear yet, that they should wait. She believed him. She always believed him. For 3 years, her mother-in-law called her a waste of time. For 3 years, she looked at her with pity and disdain. She asked in front of guests whether Nadezhda was finally planning to give the family an heir. For 3 years, Kostya remained silent, knowing the truth. Nadezhda slowly pressed the print button. The printer in the corner of the kitchen hummed, spitting out sheet after sheet. Footsteps in the hallway made her look up. Valentina Sergeyevna entered the kitchen wearing a silk robe, the same emerald one Nadezhda had bought for herself in Dubai 2 years ago. Her mother-in-law took it from the cupboard without asking, as she did with everything in this house, as if she had the right. Valentina Sergeyevna walked to the coffee maker, an Italian one brought from Milan, and pressed the button. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen. Her mother-in-law moved confidently, as if she owned the place, ignoring Nadezhda. She took a cup from the cupboard, the very one with the inscription, "To the best mom," that Kostya had given her for her birthday. Nadezhda took the printout from the printer and silently placed it on the table in front of her mother-in-law. Valentina Sergeyevna set the cup down and picked up the sheets of paper. Her eyes scanned the lines, first quickly, then more slowly. Her face changed before her eyes. Bewilderment gave way to understanding, understanding to horror. The fingers holding the paper turned white. "Kostya," she whispered. "You told me it was her." A crash from the hallway. Kostya burst into the kitchen barefoot, wearing the same pants he'd been wearing the night before. He saw the paper in his mother's hands and froze in the doorway. His face turned gray. He began to speak quickly, haltingly slurring his words. He didn't want to upset his mother. She'd dreamed of grandchildren so much, had waited so long. He wondered if the doctors were wrong, if it would go away on its own. He'd read online that things like this happened. He hoped. Nadezhda looked at him and said nothing. For 3 years he'd allowed his mother to humiliate her. For 3 years he'd listened to her call her barren, inferior, unworthy, and he'd kept quiet. He'd known the truth and kept quiet. Valentina Sergeyevna slowly turned to her son. For the first time in years, Nadezhda saw something akin to disgust in her eyes. "You lied to me?" Her mother-in-law's voice trembled. "You let me! Oh God, what did I say to her?" Kostya cringed under that gaze. He looked small, pathetic. A 40-year-old man who was more afraid of upsetting his mother than losing his wife. But instead of apologizing, Valentina Sergeyevna turned to Nadezhda. Her face was already changing, choosing a new expression. Not remorse. No, something else. "You have to understand," she said. "I didn't know. It's his fault. I never would have if I had known." Nadezhda looked at her mother-in-law and understood. She didn't regret her cruelty. She only regretted being wrong. If Nadezhda really were barren, the persecution would have continued with the same contempt, the same jabs, the same photograph of dead Lenochka on the nightstand. Nadezhda got up from the table, silently walked past her mother-in-law, past her husband, into the bedroom. She opened the closet and took out her suitcase, the very one she'd taken with her on flights. She began packing. Kostya appeared in the doorway. He grabbed her hand and turned her toward him. There were tears in his eyes, real ones she could see. "Wait," he said. "I'll fix everything. I'll transfer the apartment back to Mom. I'll give you back the money, all 180,000, every penny. Just don't leave." Nadezhda looked at his hand, squeezing her wrist, then looked up and met his gaze. She was silent, and in that silence was everything. 3 years of lies, 3 years of humiliation, 3 years of his cowardice. "Give me back the money?" she finally asked. "Which one?" "The money I earned flying late-night flights while you bought an apartment behind my back, or the 3 years I kept quiet while your mother called me a waste of time?" Kostya unclenched his fingers and took a step back. He opened his mouth to reply, but Nadezhda had already turned to the closet. She continued folding her things methodically, carefully, like she folded her uniform before every flight. Her hands weren't shaking. Inside, it was empty and cold, like an airplane cabin at 10,000 meters. Like this video, so YouTube knows you're interested in video stories like this and recommends more high-quality stories. Kostya swore he'd bring the money today. Right now, in front of her, he'd open the app and transfer all 180,000 rubles to her account. He spoke as he stood in the bedroom doorway while Nadezhda packed her suitcase, his voice trembling with a sincerity she no longer believed. Nadezhda pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. Their joint account, into which she transferred money after each flight, showed a balance of 12,400 rubles. She turned the screen toward Kostya and said nothing. He froze, rubbing his neck in the gesture she knew by heart. The rest went toward renovations, he explained. My parents' apartment was in terrible condition. Nothing had been done there for 20 years. I wanted to fix it up so I could rent it out for more. It's an investment, after all, for both of us. The money will come back. It just takes time. There was no money. The $180,000 she'd saved over 3 years had vanished into someone else's walls, someone else's pipes, someone else's parquet floor. Valentina Sergeyevna appeared in the bedroom doorway. She'd managed to change out of Nadezhda's robe and into her own dress, looking collected and businesslike. She had a plan. It was evident in every movement. She proposed a compromise. Nadezhda would stay in this apartment, and she and her husband would move into their parents' renovated apartment. Kostya would pay off the debt in installments, $20,000 a month. In 9 months, everything would be back. That was reasonable, right? That was fair. Nadezhda looked at her mother-in-law and understood what she was being offered, the role of creditor to a husband who had betrayed her. 9 months to live in an apartment with a photograph of a dead woman on the nightstand. 9 months of waiting for handouts from the man who stole her dream. The phone rang, the captain's number. Nadezhda answered, hearing a familiar voice. There's an urgent flight to Yekaterinburg tomorrow. The relief is sick. We need a replacement. Departure at 6 o'clock in the morning. She agreed without hesitation. She needed to escape this apartment, to rise into the sky, where the air was clean and thin, where there was no mother-in-law, no husband, no photographs in mourning frames. The rest of the day passed in a strange numbness. Nadezhda unpacked her suitcase. Tomorrow she would need her uniform. She cooked dinner because her body moved on autopilot. She sat in the kitchen while Kostya and her mother-in-law whispered in the bedroom, thinking she couldn't hear. That night, she lay down on the sofa in the living room. She gave up the bedroom without a fight, not wanting to sleep where it smelled of someone else's perfume and where a dead Lenochka stared at her from the nightstand. Sleep wouldn't come. Nadezhda lay in the darkness and listened to the sounds of the apartment. The hum of the refrigerator, the creaking of the floorboards, muffled voices from the kitchen. Kostya and her mother-in-law were also awake. Valentina Sergeyevna's voice was clear. She didn't bother lowering her tone. She'll cool off. People like her won't go anywhere. She's 34, she has no children. Who needs her? She'll cry and come back. They always come back. Nadezhda waited for Kostya to object, to say that he loved her, that she was different, that her mother was wrong. Kostya was silent or agreed. She didn't hear his answer, only an indistinct muttering. She lay in the darkness, remembering how she and Kostya had dreamed of their own apartment when they'd just gotten married, how she'd shown him ads on real estate websites, how they'd calculated how much they needed to save for a down payment, how she'd booked extra flights, night flights, holidays, bad weather, how she'd saved on everything, clothes, cosmetics, vacations, how he'd said, hugging her, "Just a little while longer, and we'll have our own house." A house had appeared, only not theirs, his, for his mother, with her money. Toward morning, Nadezhda got up from the couch. It was 5 o'clock, and the sun was shining outside. She went into the kitchen, turned on the kettle, and pulled a notepad and pen from her bag. She wrote out the divorce petition by hand, using a template from the internet. The handwriting was neat, the letters didn't shake. She reread the text twice, checking the dates and wording. Next to the application, she placed a note. "Sign this while I'm gone. I'll be back in 3 days to pick up my things." Then she put on her uniform, grabbed her suitcase, and left the apartment. The door closed behind her with a soft click. The landing smelled of damp and cats. The light on the second floor was still out. Nadezhda went downstairs and went outside. The morning air was cold and damp, smelling of melted snow and exhaust fumes. She took a deep breath and walked to the bus stop. Fear only set in on the bus on the way to the airport. It washed over her like a wave, constricting her throat, making her grip the handrail. She was 34 years old, no children, no money, no home. Who needed her? But along with the fear came something else, something like determination. She had taken the first step. Now she needed to take the second. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. At 10,000 meters, the phone had no signal. Nadezhda pushed the drinks cart down the aisle, smiling at the passengers, pouring tomato juice and coffee, and all the while thinking about only one thing. Now Kostya had woken up. Now he had gone into the kitchen. Now he had seen the statement on the table. She imagined his face, that same expression of confusion that appeared every time something didn't go according to plan. He probably reread the note several times, disbelieving his eyes. Then he called his mother, then started dialing her number over and over, listening to the beeps and the mechanical voice of the answering machine. The plane rocked in turbulence. Nadezhda held the cart and continued working. His hands moved automatically. Her body remembered every movement from years of flying. It was calming. Perhaps she could do something familiar while everything inside her was burning. After landing in Yekaterinburg, she turned on her phone and watched the screen fill with notifications. 17 missed calls from Kostya, 8 from her mother-in-law, 3 from an unknown number, 23 messages on Messenger. She listened to Kostya's voicemail in the airport restroom, locked in a stall. First, sobs, real, choking ones. Then please. Come back, forgive me, I'll make it right. Then threats. If you don't come back, I don't know what I'll do to you. It will be your fault. She knew this tactic. He used it every time she tried to talk about his mother, about money, about the future. Tears, promises, threats, and she retreated. She wouldn't retreat again. The unfamiliar number turned out to be a lawyer. His voice was dry, businesslike, and emotionless. He introduced himself as Valentina Sergeyevna's assistant and said that if Nadezhda filed for divorce with property division, they would contest her rights to her savings. They had a witness, a neighbor from the apartment across the street, who would confirm that Nadezhda barely lived at home, that her husband earned the money, and that she only spent it. Nadezhda listened and felt her fear give way to something else, a cold, calculating anger. They were preparing. They knew she would leave, and they had been preparing for it in advance. She called Marina right from the arrivals hall. Her friend answered immediately, as if she'd been expecting the call. "She's already checked everything," Marina said. "The parents' apartment was sold to Kostya for a third of the market price. This could be contested as a sham transaction disguised as a gift. But you need a good lawyer, and good lawyers cost money." Nadezhda remembered her vacation pay. 80,000 in a separate account Kostya didn't know about. She was putting it aside for a rainy day in case she had to urgently fly to see her mother in Saratov or pay for some medical treatment. The rainy day had arrived. In the arrivals hall, someone called her name. She turned and saw Andrei, the co-pilot with whom she had been flying for the past 6 months. Tall, calm, with attentive gray eyes. He looked at her face and didn't ask anything. He simply took her bag and led her to the cafe on the second floor. They sat at a table by the window, and Nadezhda began her story. At first haltingly, jumping from one thing to another, then more evenly in greater detail. She spoke out loud for the first time about her mother-in-law, about the photograph on the nightstand, about the stolen money, about the diagnosis Kostya had kept hidden for 3 years. Andrei listened without interrupting, only nodding occasionally and pouring her tea. When she finished, he was silent for a minute, then said he knew a family lawyer, a good one, the kind who wins difficult cases. He owed Andrei a favor from the army, and if Nadezhda wanted, he would call today. Nadezhda wanted. That evening, she sat in her hotel room. She hadn't gone home. She'd rented a room near the airport. On the bed lay a notebook with a list, documents for the court, things to be removed from the apartment, people she could ask for help. For the first time in 3 days, she felt not despair, but something resembling a plan. The phone rang at 9 o'clock in the evening, an unfamiliar number but different from the one he'd heard that morning. A male voice introduced himself, Lawyer Igor Vladimirovich. Andrei had already explained the situation. He'd researched what he could find in a few hours and was ready to take on the case. "The apartment deal is a sham," he said. "The price is 3 times too low, that's obvious. We can get it declared invalid and include the apartment in the marital property. But the main thing is, if the husband used the joint savings without his wife's consent, that's grounds for compensation. She has bank statements, receipts, transfers. She had everything. She kept every piece of paper, every receipt, every transfer confirmation." Kostya laughed at her pedantry, calling her a bore. "Now this pedantry will save her life." The lawyer paused, and Nadezhda heard him shuffling through papers. Then he spoke again, his voice changing. "There's one more thing. I checked your husband's records." Standard procedure. A month ago, he filed an application at the Civil Registry Office to register his marriage with another woman. The application was withdrawn a week later, but the record remains. Her clothes froze, her gaze fixed on the wall of the hotel room. Only a month had passed since she, exhausted but happy, had fallen asleep in her beloved's arms, returning from business trips to Novosibirsk and Krasnoyarsk. Meanwhile, he had filed an application to marry another woman. "What's her name?" she blurted out, and her own voice seemed unfamiliar. The lawyer said the name, Elena Viktorovna Drozdova. Nadezhda closed her eyes. She knew the name. The younger sister of the late Lenochka, Kostya's first wife, the one who invariably appeared at all family celebrations, sat side by side with her mother-in-law, consuming Nadezhda with undisguised hostility. The photograph in a mourning frame on the bedside table took on an ominous meaning. Lawyer Igor Vladimirovich laid out the papers on the table and, looking at Nadezhda over his glasses, said, "The picture is emerging with absolute clarity." Kostya had been plotting a divorce long before his parents moved into their shared apartment. His marriage petition to Elena Drozdova had been filed a month earlier. The apartment, registered in his name at a clearly undervalued price, served as a means to remove property from the division of property. His mother-in-law was aware of this and was fully conniving. Her move was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to force Nadezhda to leave without scandal or litigation. Nadezhda listened and remembered Elena, thin, quiet, with dark hair like her late sister. She would show up at family celebrations, sit next to her mother-in-law, barely saying a word. Back then, Nadezhda had simply thought her shy. Now she realized Elena had been waiting for Nadezhda to be ousted from the family so she could take her place. The photograph of Lenochka in a mourning frame on the nightstand took on a new, eerie meaning. This wasn't just a cult of the departed wife. It was a reminder of who should rightfully be at Kostya's side, a woman from the same family with the same face, the same voice. The hearing was scheduled for March. For 3 months, Nadezhda lived in a rented room, flying on flights and gathering documents, bank statements confirming her transfers to the General Savings Fund, 3 years' worth of salary statements, an expert's report on the market value of her parents' apartment, and a copy of the withdrawn marriage petition. The lawyer managed to obtain it through contacts at the registry office. Kostya called every day for the first 2 weeks, then the calls became less frequent, and then stopped altogether. His mother-in-law didn't call even once, only sending one short message, "You'll regret it." Nadezhda entered the courtroom wearing her best suit, a dark blue, formal one, bought before the wedding. Kostya sat across from her, pale and haggard. Next to him, Valentina Sergeevna, in a black dress, as if attending a funeral. Their lawyer, the one with the dry voice, was shuffling papers. Igor Vladimirovich spoke calmly and methodically, presenting evidence after evidence, statements, certificates, expert reports. He clearly demonstrated how Nadezhda's funds had been deposited into a joint account, how this account had been emptied to purchase the apartment, and how the transaction price had been understated by 1/3. He saved the withdrawn marriage application for last, as irrefutable evidence of malice. Kostya's lawyer attempted to counter this, insisting that the savings were her husband's personal funds, that Nadezhda was rarely home, and that the apartment deal was merely routine assistance to her parents. But the bank statements proved otherwise. Every transfer was signed in her name, every amount documented. Kostya remained silent throughout the entire trial. Only once did he look up and glance at Nadezhda with that same expression of confusion she knew by heart. She turned away. The judge read the decision in a level voice. The purchase and sale of the apartment is deemed fictitious, disguising a gift. The apartment is included in the jointly acquired property. The plaintiff is awarded compensation in the amount of half the apartment's value, plus her share of savings. The defendant is obligated to pay 2,300,000 rubles. Valentina Sergeyevna jumped up and started to say something, but the lawyer gently sat her back down. Kostya sat motionless, staring at the floor. He looked small, lost. A 40-year-old man who had never learned to accept the consequences of his own decisions. After the hearing, Nadezhda went out into the hallway and stood by the window. Outside the window, wet snow was falling, and cars crawled slowly along the gray street. She felt a strange emptiness, not the joy of victory, not relief, but only a silence within. Footsteps behind her made her turn. Valentina Sergeyevna stood 3 steps away, looking her straight in the eyes for the first time in 4 years. Her mother-in-law's face was hard, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You ruined his life," she said. Nadezhda paused for a moment. Then she answered, "No, Valentina Sergeyevna, you raised a son who doesn't know how to take responsibility for his actions, who lies to avoid upsetting his mother, who betrays his wife to please you. You did this, not me." Her mother-in-law opened her mouth, but found no words. She stood there for a few seconds, then turned and walked down the hallway, her heels clicking on the government-issued linoleum. A year later, Nadezhda stood in the departure lounge of Domodedovo Airport. Next to her was Andrei, now her husband. They had registered quietly, without a lavish wedding, at the local registry office. Marina and the captain were witnesses. 6-year-old Tioma, whom they had adopted from an orphanage 3 months earlier, fussed between them. A boy with serious eyes and a quiff on the top of his head, who had been afraid to fall asleep alone for the first week and flinched at loud noises. Now he tugged at Nadezhda's hand and asked, "Mom, are we really going to fly together, the 3 of us?" Andrei winked at her over his son's head. He had secured a family flight south for them. Their first vacation together, Tioma's first seaside getaway, their first real summer. Last week, Nadezhda had met a former neighbor from her old building. She told her the news. Kostya was still living alone in their apartment. His mother-in-law returned to her parents' apartment. Kostya transferred the apartment back to her, trying to make amends. Elena Drozdova married someone else, an engineer from the Moscow region. A photograph of his first wife, framed in mourning, still sits on Kostya's bedroom nightstand. Nadezhda listened and felt something strange. No malice, no satisfaction, something akin to pity. Kostya remained stuck in the past, in the shadow of his dead wife and living mother. He never grew up, never became an adult, never learned to build his own future. The boarding call for their flight sounded. Tioma jumped with delight and pulled Nadezhda toward the gate. Andrei grabbed his bags and followed, smiling. Nadezhda walked down the long corridor toward the plane, thinking about how strange life was. A year ago, she stood at this same airport alone, penniless, homeless, and without a future. She was 34, childless, and her mother-in-law said, "Who needs her?" Now she had a home. She had a husband who never made her feel temporary. She had a son who called her mom and believed she would never abandon him. She was finally herself.